sector. President Cyril Ramaphosa says government will rework regulatory frameworks around the production and the cannabis and hemp products to grow the sector. President Ramaphosa was delivering the State of the Nation address on Thursday. He says processes will be streamlined so that the sector can thrive and create more jobs. For more on that, we're now joined by I Sibusiso Xaba, the CEO of the African Cannabis Advisory Group. But before we speak to him, let's now listen to what the President said.
We will review the policy and regulatory framework for a whole number of other processes, but more importantly, which will come as sweet news for our people in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, for industrial hemp and cannabis to realize huge potential for investment and job creation.
There we have it. The President said that in his State of the Nation address last night that hemp and cannabis production can create 130,000 new jobs. So, Sibusiso, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. First of all, what's your reaction to his proclamation that government will fast-track regulations for the cannabis industry in South Africa?
Good evening, Simpiwe. Thank you so much for having me on today, and a good evening to the viewers as well. So I think this proclamation is certainly one that is received with great excitement by not only the current private sector cannabis operators, but also, as he touched on, many rural and indigenous communities that have been working and earning an income from the cultivation and sale of cannabis for decades. And so as we sort of assess the country's economic and social situation, this is certainly a sector that can really put a dent on unemployment and truly create long-term sustainable opportunities for a broad range of South African stakeholders.
Well, the President said industrial hemp and cannabis will realize huge potential for investment and job creation. So what's your understanding then of the punted regulation with regards to small-scale farmers or individual merchants who may not necessarily trading on an industrial scale?
Sure. So at present, the legislative and regulatory framework for cannabis is really geared towards more medical cannabis in South Africa. So currently around 50 licenses have been issued to date, and these operations require significant amounts of capital to really operate. You're talking at a minimum 5 million, but on average around 20 million, and you even have projects that go all the way up to 400 million. However, the government has been taking a phased approach in introducing legislation into the industry, and we do expect some framework that does allow for indigenous growers, smallhold farmers, traditional cannabis using communities to also be able to be integrated into this formal framework under which we are trying to set up.
Well, are there any open channels for the facilitation of the development of the appropriate market support infrastructure, like what, processing plants and storage facilities, perhaps?
Sure. So there are currently a broad range of infrastructure initiatives that have been completed and are in the process of being completed. However, South Africa is still a very significant way away from having sufficient infrastructure for this industry to thrive and succeed. And that, to some degree, has been a function of the staggered approach under which cannabis has been legalized in the country. And so we are of the view that once legislation and regulation is conducive, the investment community will begin to be confident to deploy capital into this industry, and that necessary infrastructure will be there to help ensure that the industry gets off the ground.
Well, cannabis has been shrouded in controversy for so many years, and there's been much contestation around the Cannabis for Private Purposes bill that does not go far enough in addressing concerns around children and second-hand smoke and the impact on road users. Are we seemingly and inadvertently shying away from these concerns?
So I would argue to the contrary, particularly when you look at the feedback that has been provided by certain groups around the Cannabis Master Plan, where these concerns have been raised, and I do believe that they are being taken up. So ensuring, for example, that minors are protected in the way of being able to access cannabis or being in proximity of people who consume cannabis. Driving has also been a big discussion point in terms of ensuring that people do not drive intoxicated in cannabis. And so I think the engagement so far do seem to be quite balanced, looking at the opportunities within the sector, but also looking to ensure that there are protective sort of mechanisms to make sure that this industry doesn't have any sort of negative impact.
Is there any monitoring mechanism, perhaps, that cannabis products or dacha or marijuana products are not sold to children or those under 18?
Sure. So at present, the sale of high THC cannabis in South Africa is actually not legal. And this can be a little bit confusing because we know that in 2018, the Constitutional Court ruled that the growing and consumption of cannabis within a private space by an adult is legal. But the commercial sale of cannabis is still not legal within this country unless you are a licensed producer. And even then, if you are a licensed producer at present, the framework allows actually for export only. So the sale of THC products, with THC being the element in cannabis that can get you high, is actually all done illegally or not under any legal framework. So the hope is that as South Africa introduces medical, large-scale domestic medical cannabis programs, that these protective mechanisms are put in place to ensure that minors are not able to access cannabis, except those who need it for medicinal reasons, because there is quite a large contingent of children who actually do need cannabis for medicinal purposes, especially those suffering from epilepsy and so forth. So we are still to get to that point, but we do hope that enough protective measures are put in place.
Yeah, and speaking of protective measures, will they extend to protecting those who claim to be, in possession of cannabis or hemp or any other marijuana products for medicinal purposes without any proof, of course?
Sure. So the regulator, SAPRA, is yet to introduce a formal, sort of a medical cannabis card or a means of sort of indicating that someone is in possession of cannabis for medical purposes. However, under the proposed Cannabis for Private Purposes bill, individuals are allowed to have small amounts of cannabis on them for whatever reason that is, whether it's recreational or medical. And so we do have sort of we are actually quite early in the development of these frameworks in South Africa, and we do hope that this year we begin to see some of these sort of frameworks and protective measures come into place. But at this moment, there's little to no legal high THC cannabis that has been distributed in South Africa, except under exceptional circumstances from SAPRA.
All right, Sibusiso, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Simpiwe.
All right, that was Sibusiso Xaba, the CEO at the African Cannabis Advisory Group.